Hi there, my name is Caroline Spaeth, and I'm chatting today with composer Faye-Ellen Silverman. She is currently on the faculties at Juilliard and NYU, is a founding board member of the International Women's Brass Conference, is secretary of the board of New York Women Composers, and has won numerous awards for her compositions such as the National League of American Pen Women's Biennial Music Award, the Yearly Standard Award from ASCAP, and this fall for Marshall Opera's Oral History Project, I'll be performing the soprano aria, The Excommunication of Spinoza from A Free Pen, which she wrote to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. Welcome, Faye-Ellen.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks to Jim for putting on the Martial Arts Opera Project, which is really a wonderful addition to what is going on in the world of opera.
Yes, I agree. So I'd love to start out with talking about your general background. I know you do have a background in Dalcroze and singing in choirs and playing in orchestras. So how has that influenced your compositional choices and development?
Well, Dalcroze was an amazing experience because it led me to a lot of freedom. The Dalcroze method is basically one of moving to music. But in addition, and it starts from the human heartbeat, but in addition to that, there is a lot of improvisation that is part of the method, or at least was when I was in school. And there was a lot of feeling that you should just do things spontaneously, but also that there were other things that got written out. So improvisation is not something that I do, but it gave me a freedom to explore things and to create things on the moment and then to refine from there. The other thing about Dalcroze is that we had weekly composition assignments. So I got used to the idea of writing music on a regular basis, not waiting for inspiration to strike, which is something that, even though it's been disproved, it is carried over for many generations, that when the inspiration strikes, that's where you go. In terms of the other things that I did, I've always been involved with a lot of musical activities. And these activities included, just because it was fun, singing in choirs, playing in concert bands, playing in orchestras. Piano was my first instrument, and I have performed even professionally a bit on it. But I also played the clarinet for many years, and I played the viola for a couple of years. And not only did I have the experience of being part of an ensemble and being aware of what a performer needs to do, but I also gained knowledge of these kinds of instruments and the instruments around me and how all the instruments blended. So I had really firsthand experience with a lot of music, in addition to having a good time with it.
Absolutely. And Faye-Ellen has sent me some wonderful articles, which I'm going to link to at the end of the video. But there was one certain phrase I wanted to talk about. You warn of the quote unquote over intellectualization of music. And I would love to hear how you've encountered that in your career, specifically as a women composer, and how you have challenged that in your own music.
When I came of age at school, it was during the 1970s. And even though serialism had been around in the university since the 1950s, there was still a very prominent part of the school that believed in serialism. I have no problem with anybody writing in any style that works for them. But the idea that there is one way to write is always a little bit dangerous. And the serial proponents really wanted everything to be explained exactly. So one of the pieces that I wrote was my dissertation. It was a half-hour opera on a Jewish theme called The Miracle of Nimerov. And in this piece, I had various characters. And for the characters, I set up certain intervallic and other aspects that would characterize them. But I couldn't specifically say why I used a certain interval. In other words, if a singer went from a C to an E, why did I start on a C and end on an E? I could say I needed a third, but why did I need that third? And that was not easily explicable. And this is just one of many instances. I also discovered that people who just follow a system without it being part of their soul, without it being part of their intrinsic makeup, end up writing pieces that really don't have any personality. So while I have no problem with people who use an intellectual basis in some way, this was a problem. And one example that always struck me was the whole way that Alban Berg did Wozzeck or Yanis Xenakis did his various pieces. In the case of Yanis Xenakis, I heard a lot of his lectures at Barnard. He came as a guest speaker for a week. And everything he talked about was formulas. He wrote us this book called Formalized Music, and everything he talked about was this formula and the gases and the this and the that. And I finally realized in listening to his music, something that he admitted to much, much later, which is that this was really about his experiences in World War II. He was fighting against the Nazis. He was injured. He had lost one eye. He lost hearing in one ear, I believe, or at least had much damage in that ear. He had a cut on his face that he personally was embarrassed by for many years. He always did a portrait sideways. And the war affected him in many ways. He was sentenced to death in his country, and only later he was able to go back to Greece when they lifted that. So he went from Greece into France. And one of the things that he did was he wrote this music, which was all contained in formulas, but was really, you could hear the explosions of war behind everything he did. So for me, his music is very powerful, but it's not necessarily about the formulas. And in his case, he needed to intellectualize. So I don't think it was over intellectualizing, but anybody who was trying to pick up on what he did would miss what was behind it and would only go for the formulas and things like that, which to me were not the best way of getting music that communicates.
It's missing that organic component there.
Definitely.
And it's so funny that you talk about following these certain formulas. Of course, there's a whole big conversation going on in the general culture about, AI and chat GPT and, all that stuff. So it sounds like, there's this danger of, if you follow these certain formulas, that music kind of loses that natural connection to, the human experience and psyche. And it just starts to sound like, like a machine could have done it.
Exactly. But I think AI will be helpful, but I don't think that it will depend where it's used. For instance, in films, it's possible to create certain kinds of background from certain kinds of sounds, because a lot of film music used to, I don't know what it does now, but it used to work from banks of sound that or libraries of sound that were created, because I had been asked at one point if some of my stuff could go into a library. It was never used, but could go into one of those libraries. But I still think that one of the things about music that is unique is that the ability of the person to convey what's within them. And I don't think, maybe AI will reach that stage. I don't know where it'll go, but I'm not really worried that it will replace me, at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right that there is definitely that human element that is missing from some of these, artificial intelligence systems that, it can be convenient to use in in a pinch, but I do think, people can recognize like when something is coming from actual human experience as opposed to it being, artificially generated.
I definitely agree with you.
Yeah. So any particular, leading into the next question, any particular challenges in your career that you've found notable, or, that you'd want to talk about?
There are a few things. The first is one that I have mentioned before. I've only started talking about it fairly recently, where my experiences as a graduate student at Harvard. Until that time, I had gone to a very supportive music school, or music schools, because I spent 1 year at a different music school. After 12 years at Dalcross, I went to Manhattan School, and then I left early for college. And then I was at a women's college, which is also very supportive. So when I went to Harvard, I was really surprised when they did a survey, and I could sense this from other people, but they did a survey. This was the beginning of the women's movement, and they asked about women in composition, and they actually published the results in a pamphlet. So this is how I know it was in that study, in that letter. And our chairman at the time said there are some things women shouldn't do, such as shovel coal and write music. And obviously this did not create a great environment for me to be working in. And then I had another faculty member there said, well, I don't even think you're going to get a doctorate, let alone have a career in music, let alone write music. And this not only wasn't true, but I just thought this was totally unnecessary. It worked out well. I went back to Columbia, which had always been more supportive. And also I had such a background that it didn't discourage me, but I don't think that that was a great thing to happen. And also it meant that the people who would have been good contacts in terms of performing things and doing things were not available to me. And the other setback I had, and I'm not sure if it was because I was a woman and this was the advice I was given, was that a career just happens. And for many, many years, I believed it. And it was actually a friend of mine who I met in my late 30s and early 40s, and who said to me from the world of business, "This is crazy. What do you mean it will just happen?" It's not that he could give advice. It was that your thinking is crazy. Where are you getting these ideas from? And it took a while longer, but I suddenly began to realize that things don't just happen. And I think that that interfered with some of the things that I could have been doing in terms of just sharing my music with people who might be interested in it.
Mhm. And of course, you and I have discussed this before. I think, there is a prevailing theme even today that like those who identify as female are not encouraged to, talk themselves up or promote their work or, even say they're doing good work. They're just expected to be automatically humble and kind of downplay their achievements. So I'm sure, I know in my experiences, it certainly impeded me from, promoting myself or trying to, get my own career going.
I'm sure. And I also think that when a woman promotes herself and when a man promotes himself, it is taken differently. The
Exactly.
same thing could
Exactly.
be said, but someone would take it as a positive for a man and a negative for a woman. And I
Hmm.
think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier you had grown up with Judaism, and I'd love to hear more how this reflects in your work.
Well, I did a study, a list a while ago for a friend who was writing a grant that we never decided to finish up on. But he had asked me to list which of my pieces were reflective of my Jewish tradition. And my Jewish tradition, I might add, was a secular tradition. I grew up speaking Yiddish, or trying to, since I don't really speak it anymore. I could read it for a while, but even that is kind of fading. Jewish folklore, Jewish history, Jewish music, Jewish secular music, folk music. And that had always been part of my background. And so I discovered, as I was starting to say, from this list I put together, that about almost half of my pieces reflect Judaism in some way. Sometimes it's very direct. I mentioned that I did this opera, a half hour, called The Miracle of Nemirov, and it is based on a Jewish short story. And it actually includes a tape of a Jewish prayer that was recorded by a cantor for me who helped me out. He was at Jewish Theological Seminary. And all of that became part of the dissertation. But in addition, some of my music progresses by seconds. I had a teacher at Manhattan School of Music who was a private teacher after I had gone to 12 years at Dalcross. I went to Manhattan for a year for private lessons. And this teacher pointed out to me that a lot of my music at that time was moving by seconds in terms of its root movements, rather than by the circle fifths, which somebody raised on the Western tradition would do. And it's not that I didn't learn a lot of Western music. I mean, I was playing the piano since age 6.5, and I was doing other things, singing at Dalcross before that. But that was kind of how my mind worked. So some of my music uses actual Jewish themes. There is a piece called Protected Sleep, for instance, which is for marimba and French horn. It was written at the request of David Jolie, who had converted to Judaism and wanted a piece with Judaism. And it uses a Sephardic song that is broken up and used within it. So sometimes the actual music is used. And this is something that Bartok does also, sometimes uses pieces of actual music. And sometimes I just use the augmented second. And I've noticed that a lot of my music tends towards an augmented second in certain places where it makes the choices. So Judaism has been important in many ways. It's the background that I grew up with. It's the background I feel comfortable with. It's the background that reminds me of family.
And it sounds like your ear was kind of organically adapted to that specific, specifically, when you talk about the augmented second, that was drawn to that just as something you felt comfortable with and felt you could explore more.
Definitely. And it just occurred naturally. It's not like I woke up one day and said, okay, let me start using augmented seconds. It's just that I gravitated towards those sounds.
Exactly.
Just like
Exactly.
some of my pieces will gravitate more towards minor types of sounds.
Hmm. So, are there any compositions that you feel like are especially significant in your career? Or if you had to choose the most personally representative works from your canon, what would they be?
One of the works I would choose is A Free Pen. And that is the piece for which you are doing the soprano aria, the excommunication of Spinoza. And the reason for this is that it has to do with social justice and the idea of freedom of speech. I grew up in a household that was very much leftist in its politics. And I went to camps and other places that placed emphasis on social justice, as well as folk music, as well as all kinds of things that fed into my music. And the whole idea of free speech is very important to me, because if you do not allow people to speak freely, you do not get different points of view. And that is the thing that ended the whole A Free Pen, in addition to going through examples of quick criticisms of free speech, was the idea by Euripides that who can give arguments unless from both sides they clearly hear they're pleased. You have to hear both sides. You can't do justice, you can't do arguments without the idea of balancing this out. And I know that several people on Facebook are always quick to defriend people. It's like, this person voted this way, or how could you be friends with this person? They voted this way, or how could you go out with this person? They voted this way. And I believe exactly everything along those lines, that's it. Out of my life. And to me, this makes no sense. I like the idea that people have different thoughts. It is fine with me that they choose to reason the world differently. And I feel that I can always learn from what they are saying and what they are doing, that if my ideas can't hold up against their ideas in my mind, then maybe I have to rethink my own ideas. So I always have been open to various points of view, and that is another reason why I think A Free Pen is an important work. This is a theme that I picked up earlier when I did a choral piece called For Showing Truth, which had to do with Leighton Hunt, who was put in jail for, as John Keats said, showing truth to flattered state. And it will continue to be a concern of mine as long as the world continues to be an intolerant place, which is probably way beyond my lifetime. So that is one piece. Another piece would be a piece that I wrote for orchestra called Adhesions. I think that the idea of writing for orchestra shows off certain aspects of what I do, since most of my works have to do with writing for chamber, because that is more practical. And the piece did get done by a few orchestras, and hopefully it may someday be done by other orchestras. And also someday I may be able to write more works for orchestra, especially if I get a commission or a chance to actually get them performed. But the way the piece developed and the materials of the piece, I was just very happy with the way the piece turned out and with the variety of sounds I could use. One of the bases of what I do has to do with instrumental timbre. I'm into timbre, I'm into colors in terms of dress, in terms of life, in terms of everything. In fact, at Manus, one of my students told me that I was by far the most colorfully dressed professor that they had. So I love instrumental color, and an orchestra allows for that. Not that you can't get colors in anything you do, but an orchestra, wow, all of these colors that are available, it's just incredible to me. So that's a second piece. Then there are a few pieces that I like because they are very personal. One would be a piece called A Time to Mourn, which I wrote for Susan Slaughter, who founded the IWBC, the International Women's Brass Conference, and has been important in its carrying it on, in subsidizing it, in making sure that it will continue. It was founded because there were very few women brass players around. And we also discovered that not too many women were writing music for brass. And now I can say that many, many women are writing music for brass, and there are more women being accepted into various situations, although the situation isn't perfect yet. So I wrote for her A Time to Mourn because she had lost her long-term partner, and I wanted to give her something that came from me. And I figured, what could more come from me than giving my time, because I'm a very slow composer. So to write a piece that is a 5-minute solo for cornet was still a gift of time, and it was also coming from the heart. And maybe because of that, other trumpet and cornet players have expressed a lot of interest in the piece and in their response to it. Also, I have written for a lot of different groups. I've written string pieces that I could talk to you about. I could list woodwind pieces, brass pieces, piano pieces. I've written for a lot of different chamber ensembles. But I also, especially because you're a singer, want to talk about a piece called Reflections on a Distant Love. And this piece was a song cycle that I wrote a few years ago. And the whole idea of a song cycle is the way I like to write vocal music. I like to write music that tells a story. And that's certainly what this piece did. It was written in the time of COVID. It certainly reflected the time of COVID, because at that time I was cut off from some of my friends. New York had a strict policy which wouldn't let in people, even if this was before the vaccine came up, but they were just cutting off people because they were afraid that they might come in and bring in COVID. And while I know that some of my friends got around it in various illegal ways, a couple of my friends did not want to do anything illegal, so I didn't get to see them. And so I began to create a story about a relationship which would last beyond life itself. In other words, that what we couldn't do here, maybe at another time, it would live on forever. And so from there, I created the story. And that's why the love was distant. It was due to the COVID restrictions or other restrictions that would come up that would prevent two people from getting together. It could be war. It could be somebody out at war. There are many reasons why people aren't together, and the love can be of all different kinds, but there are people you just want to see physically, to have in your life, or at least for a little while. And when that is not allowed, then what are the other options?
Of course, you want to form that, you want to keep that connection going.
Definitely. And Zoom is wonderful, but it's not the same.
You can only do so much. Yes, and I'll actually include a link to Faye-Ellen's composer page on Subito, so you can see the whole canon of her works. I highly recommend you check that out. And I think this is a great segue into talking about a free pen itself. So as someone who, from what I understand, is primarily an instrumentalist as well as a composer, how did you approach writing for the voice in this?
Yes, I am primarily an instrumentalist. But I have become aware, and I've become more aware since I wrote that, of what the voice can do. First of all, the voice, like any instrument, and my brass friends have, including Susan Slaughter, I always heard her voice in my ear saying, brass instruments have to breathe, brass instruments have to breathe. Well, singers have to breathe also. So I try to be aware, are there places for them to breathe? Are there places for them to get musical cues if they don't have perfect pitch? Because when I went through a period of writing, when I was connected with all the serial composers, there were many pieces that were written that really required perfect pitch because there were no cues. So I learned, how do I give the cue? And then I began to realize that, and some of this came later than this piece, that if I wanted certain words to come across, I had to look at range. I couldn't really, even a color turret, it's magnificent up there. It's a great sound, but that is a decorative sound. That is not the sound that you want to get across a lot of words, a lot of text. So how important is the text, and how am I going to get it going? And part of what I do when I do the text is I say the text out loud. So I get a sense of how the rhythm goes on the text, and I try to go with natural rhythm on it, whether that involves changing meters in the piece or whether that involves just changing accents within a meter in the piece. And I look at the various stresses, and I know that it's important to stress a word that is important, either by going high up on it or possibly even leaping down to it or stretching it out. And so I look for those aspects in writing it. And I also have become aware in going to musical theater that of what projects and what doesn't project in terms of the words. And for instance, if you go to a show by Stephen Sondheim, or you go to a show by the traditional composers such as Rodgers and Hammerstein, the words project. So I try to think, why is it that those words project? Or Kurt Weill, who came from a classical background, but his words project, his shows project. So how are they doing it? And I try to figure it out. One of the things that I look for is how the vowels are used. And that did not work out so well when I was doing a free pen. It's something that I've learned since then. In a free pen, in the aria that you are singing, Caroline, it ends on the word he, and it also ends on a high C, which is good for you as a magnificent singer, but not necessarily so great for other people. In its fairness, it was meant to be a continuing idea. It wasn't that I was ending an entire work on a high C with a soprano, which I would only do in a very special occasion, writing for a very special singer. But the vowel that I ended on was also he. And as my publisher pointed out, this is not a great vowel to end on. It is much better to end on an O, ho, or ah, ha, which I know now. And I knew then, but I needed that word. So I think that the reason that might work, and it's up to the audience to decide, is that the phrase that is being used is cursed be he. And it's not so important to understand it as it goes high because you're throwing out a curse, but hopefully the singer will have sung it so many times that the audience will know, okay, you hear the cur and you know the rest of it is cursed be he. But as I said, I've also become really aware of vowels. Sometimes I can do something about them. In English, very often I can't, but I try to notice.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next point I wanted to make. The aria, the excommunication of Spinoza, opens a free pen, and it begins on this very striking statement, cursed be he, with the curse starting on a high A flat. Was that deliberate on your part to grab the audience's attention?
It's been a while, so I'm not sure if it was purposeful, but if it wasn't, it should have been purposeful, because I definitely wanted to catch the audience's attention. And I also wanted to have something that was not comfortable for the singer. I know that you probably have a high A flat with no problem, but many singers would not. It's just like at the beginning of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, he wrote this thing for bassoon, and it was high bassoon, and he meant it for it to be uncomfortable for the bassoon player. Unfortunately, a lot of bassoon players can now do it, so it now sounds beautiful, which is a nice sound, but he was going for that harshness, and I was also going for a harshness, that if I'm a little bit beyond somebody's comfort range, it throws out the curse. It makes it's okay not to be beautiful in the way you're singing. I know singers are trained to be beautiful, and there are times when the beauty is the sound that I want, but if you're cursing someone out, doesn't pay to be a polite woman.
Exactly. I'm gonna steal that. Yeah, when I first looked at the score, and I noticed a tessitura of it, I immediately thought of these like traditional or not so traditional, depending on what operas you're looking at. This canon of like kind of female villains, like the most obvious example is Queen of the Night from Magic Flute by Mozart. Or you can even, I think, put the Valkyries from the Ring Cycle into that category. So was that something that you were deliberately drawing on, or do you think it's just kind of coincidental?
I find that my music draws on lots of things that I've heard without not being aware of it. For instance, there was one time, and this is off the topic of this piece, but where I got to know Morty Feldman, and I was listening to his music. And so I discovered that I wrote a flute piece called Speaking Alone, which is all very soft sounds and moves slowly. It's whistle tones, it's other kinds of sounds that are very soft. And I wasn't aware of that. Or when I was writing a piece that was for chorus, I was also studying Gesualdo. And this was pre-publication. And so that piece reflected Gesualdo without my meaning to do so. And I think composers do this on a regular basis. I know that Bartók, you can almost tell what he was performing in concert, and then you listen to the pieces he wrote that year, and there's a direct correlation. So I'm always listening to things. And as Stravinsky said, good composers borrow, great composers steal. I'm not saying I'm a great composer, and I'm not sure that I'm exactly stealing, but I'm at least borrowing unconsciously in many ways. So, but this piece was not meant to be exactly it's written for soprano. I don't mean that, but it wasn't meant to be a female character. It was a woman representing the entire congregation, which actually at that time would have been male, but who would be doing cursing, but it was a female who was representing a larger group. So I think the way it's done might have been influenced, but the fact that it was a female character was not on my mind at the time.
No, yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And then I'd love to talk about how you decided to abstract the aria, whether specifically for this concert or just in general as, something to be performed in the future, which I hope it will be because it's a great piece. So I'd love to hear about how you, how you excerpted that.
It was a practical consideration. When Jim Schaefer approached me to be part of this project, the first thing I wrote back and said to him was, I'm not primarily an opera composer. I've written one half-hour opera, which I mentioned, The Miracle of Nemirov. I wrote this piece, which is not an opera, but has operatic characteristics. And some of my song cycles actually could be, I suppose, mini operas in the sense that they're 10-minute operas, but they are written as songs. So do you want me to be part of this project? And he said, yes. And because I like your music. And he told me to choose something. And I thought that this would be a very dramatic work and a way of representing something closer to opera for me. And so I started to take the scene out. And then I realized it would be much better if you just had the music for the scene, and it would be better if I could tell you where to end. And originally I was doing a whole scene with extra music at the end. And as I looked at it, because I had help from my publisher, he actually helped me with the layout because I was having trouble extracting the finale file from an earlier version because a copyist of mine had done the file. So he was working differently than I work. And my publisher was great. He was able to help me with this. And I looked at what he did and he sent it back to me for revisions. And I thought, no, it has to end with a double bar right after the soprano. Let her walk off the stage and be dramatic. It's an aria after all. So that is why I abstracted it. I thought it would be more practical for you to have something that was just an aria. And then I thought, well, maybe other people would pick it up because I know that for auditions and things that people have to present arias in English. And I was hoping that I might be able to add a little bit to the repertoire of this aria in English.
This not only has the intellectual component of being about this philosopher and this philosophical work, but I love how, there's no internal expectations of the singer's character, and that, the singer is not representing some generalized aspect about being a woman, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Faye-Ellen, for taking the time to chat today. I can't wait to premiere this, or not premiere because it's already been performed, but performed, I should say. I cannot wait to perform this aria on October 28th. And like I said earlier, I'll include some links to some great articles Faye-Ellen has written. I highly recommend you check those out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. And actually, it is a premiere as an aria. It has never been done as
There
an
we
aria
go.
apart from that. So you have your premiere there.
There we go.
And
Okay.
it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and I can't wait to hear you and to work more with you.
Thank you so much, Faye-Ellen. Take care.
You too.